Hello everyone, and welcome back to Fluent Career English.
Today we are going to practice a very common and useful topic.
We will practice how to talk about your weekend in English.
This lesson is for A1 to A2 English learners.
By the end of this lesson, you will describe your weekend clearly and confidently.
You will learn useful weekend vocabulary.
You will practice complete sentences.
You will build fluency step by step.
You will practice repetition and shadowing.
Please speak out loud.
Do not just listen.
Even simple sentences are powerful.
Let's begin.
First, listen to a short natural conversation. Hi Alex. How was your weekend?
Hi Jenny. My weekend was great.
What did you do?
On Saturday, I met my friends and watched a movie. On Sunday, I stayed home and relaxed.
That sounds nice.
Yes, I enjoyed my weekend. Now repeat the conversation sentence by sentence.
How was your weekend? How was your weekend?
My weekend was great. My weekend was great.
What did you do? What did you do?
On Saturday, I met my friends and watched a movie. On Saturday, I met my friends and watched a movie.
On Sunday, I stayed home and relaxed. On Sunday, I stayed home and relaxed.
Yes, I enjoyed my weekend. Yes, I enjoyed my weekend. Now we will build your weekend description step by step.
Let's start with basic sentences.
My weekend was busy. My weekend was busy.
My weekend was relaxing. My weekend was relaxing.
My weekend was fun. My weekend was fun.
My weekend was boring. My weekend was boring.
My weekend was exciting. My weekend was exciting.
Say how your weekend was. Say how your weekend was. Now talking about Saturday.
On Saturday, I went shopping. On Saturday, I went shopping.
On Saturday, I visited my family. On Saturday, I visited my family.
On Saturday, I cleaned my house. On Saturday, I cleaned my house.
On Saturday, I went to the gym. On Saturday, I went to the gym.
On Saturday, I watched TV. On Saturday, I watched TV.
Say what you did on Saturday. Say what you did on Saturday. Now talking about Sunday.
On Sunday, I stayed home. On Sunday, I stayed home.
On Sunday, I did my homework. On Sunday, I did my homework.
On Sunday, I went for a walk. On Sunday, I went for a walk.
On Sunday, I cooked dinner. On Sunday, I cooked dinner.
On Sunday, I met my friends. On Sunday, I met my friends.
Say what you did on Sunday. Say what you did on Sunday.
Now using past tense with went.
I went to the park. I went to the park.
I went to the cinema. I went to the cinema.
I went to a restaurant. I went to a restaurant.
I went to the beach. I went to the beach.
Say one place you went last weekend. Say one place you went last weekend.
Now using past tense with stayed and watched.
I stayed at home. I stayed at home.
I watched a movie. I watched a movie.
I watched TV. I watched TV.
I stayed with my family. I stayed with my family.
Say one thing you stayed or watched. Say one thing you stayed or watched.
Now let's build a full weekend description.
My weekend was relaxing. My weekend was relaxing.
On Saturday, I went shopping with my friends. On Saturday, I went shopping with my friends.
On Sunday, I stayed home and watched a movie. On Sunday, I stayed home and watched a movie.
I also cleaned my room. I also cleaned my room.
Overall, I enjoyed my weekend. Overall, I enjoyed my weekend.
Say the full description. Say the full description.
Now realistic scenario at work. How was your weekend?
My weekend was good. On Saturday, I visited my parents. On Sunday, I went to the park and relaxed.
Repeat key sentences.
My weekend was good. My weekend was good.
On Saturday, I visited my parents. On Saturday, I visited my parents.
On Sunday, I went to the park and relaxed. On Sunday, I went to the park and relaxed.
Answer the question about your weekend at work. Answer the question about your weekend at work. Now let's correct common mistakes. I go to the park last weekend.
Correct sentence. I went to the park last weekend. Correct sentence. I went to the park last weekend.
I stay at home yesterday.
Correct sentence. I stayed at home yesterday. Correct sentence. I stayed at home yesterday.
I watched movie on Saturday.
Correct sentence. I watched a movie on Saturday. Correct sentence. I watched a movie on Saturday.
I went to the gym.
Correct sentence. I went to the gym. Correct sentence. I went to the gym.
My weekend is very fun.
Correct sentence. My weekend was very fun. Correct sentence. My weekend was very fun. Now shadowing practice. My weekend was relaxing. My weekend was relaxing.
On Saturday, I went shopping. On Saturday, I went shopping.
On Sunday, I stayed home and watched TV. On Sunday, I stayed home and watched TV.
I enjoyed spending time with my family. I enjoyed spending time with my family.
It was a nice weekend. It was a nice weekend. Again, slightly faster. My weekend was relaxing, and I enjoyed spending time with my family. My weekend was relaxing, and I enjoyed spending time with my family.
On Saturday, I went shopping, and on Sunday, I stayed home and watched TV. On Saturday, I went shopping, and on Sunday, I stayed home and watched TV. Now listen to a natural conversation. What did you do last weekend?
Last weekend, I went shopping on Saturday and stayed home on Sunday. I watched TV and relaxed. It was a nice weekend.
That sounds relaxing.
Yes, it was. Now we will continue talking about your weekend in more detail.
In this section, you will learn how to describe a busy weekend, a relaxing weekend, and a fun weekend.
You will practice longer answers using past tense.
Speak clearly and repeat when you see. Speak clearly and repeat when you see. Let's start with a busy weekend.
My weekend was very busy. My weekend was very busy.
On Saturday, I cleaned my house. On Saturday, I cleaned my house.
I went grocery shopping in the afternoon. I went grocery shopping in the afternoon.
In the evening, I visited my grandparents. In the evening, I visited my grandparents.
On Sunday, I finished my homework. On Sunday, I finished my homework.
I prepared for the next week. I prepared for the next week.
Say 2 things you did on a busy weekend. Say 2 things you did on a busy weekend.
Now a relaxing weekend.
My weekend was relaxing. My weekend was relaxing.
On Saturday, I stayed at home. On Saturday, I stayed at home.
I watched movies and listened to music. I watched movies and listened to music.
On Sunday, I went for a walk in the park. On Sunday, I went for a walk in the park.
I read a book in the evening. I read a book in the evening.
Say 2 things you did on a relaxing weekend. Say 2 things you did on a relaxing weekend. Now a fun weekend.
My weekend was exciting. My weekend was exciting.
On Saturday, I went to a birthday party. On Saturday, I went to a birthday party.
I met my friends and danced. I met my friends and danced.
On Sunday, I played football in the park. On Sunday, I played football in the park.
We had a great time together. We had a great time together.
Say 2 things you did on a fun weekend. Say 2 things you did on a fun weekend.
Now let's practice time expressions.
On Saturday morning, I went to the gym. On Saturday morning, I went to the gym.
On Saturday afternoon, I went shopping. On Saturday afternoon, I went shopping.
On Saturday evening, I met my friends. On Saturday evening, I met my friends.
On Sunday morning, I cleaned my room. On Sunday morning, I cleaned my room.
On Sunday evening, I relaxed at home. On Sunday evening, I relaxed at home.
Use morning, afternoon, and evening in a sentence. Use morning, afternoon, and evening in a sentence.
Now let's build a longer weekend description.
My weekend was very busy but fun. My weekend was very busy but fun.
On Saturday morning, I cleaned my house. On Saturday morning, I cleaned my house.
In the afternoon, I went shopping with my sister. In the afternoon, I went shopping with my sister.
In the evening, I watched a movie with my family. In the evening, I watched a movie with my family.
On Sunday, I visited my grandparents. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents.
I also prepared for the new week. I also prepared for the new week.
Overall, I had a productive weekend. Overall, I had a productive weekend.
Say the full weekend description. Say the full weekend description.
Now, realistic scenario at school.
What did you do last weekend?
Last weekend, I visited my cousins. We played games and watched movies together. On Sunday, I did my homework and prepared for school.
Repeat key sentences.
Last weekend, I visited my cousins. Last weekend, I visited my cousins.
We played games and watched movies together. We played games and watched movies together.
On Sunday, I did my homework. On Sunday, I did my homework.
Answer the question about your weekend at school. Answer the question about your weekend at school. Now let's correct more common mistakes. I go to shopping on Saturday.
Correct sentence. I went shopping on Saturday. Correct sentence. I went shopping on Saturday.
I did watch TV.
Correct sentence. I watched TV. Correct sentence. I watched TV.
I was go to the park.
Correct sentence. I went to the park. Correct sentence. I went to the park.
I stay home all day Sunday.
Correct sentence. I stayed home all day Sunday. Correct sentence. I stayed home all day Sunday.
My weekend was very bored.
Correct sentence. My weekend was very boring. Correct sentence. My weekend was very boring. Now longer shadowing practice. My weekend was busy but fun. My weekend was busy but fun.
On Saturday morning I cleaned my house. On Saturday morning I cleaned my house.
In the afternoon, I went shopping with my sister. In the afternoon, I went shopping with my sister.
On Sunday I visited my grandparents and relaxed. On Sunday I visited my grandparents and relaxed.
I had a productive and enjoyable weekend. I had a productive and enjoyable weekend. Again, faster. My weekend was busy but fun, and I enjoyed every moment. My weekend was busy but fun, and I enjoyed every moment.
On Saturday I cleaned my house and went shopping, and on Sunday I visited my grandparents. On Saturday I cleaned my house and went shopping, and on Sunday I visited my grandparents. Now listen to a natural conversation. How was your weekend?
My weekend was busy but fun. On Saturday, I cleaned my house and went shopping. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents and relaxed at home. I had a productive weekend.
That sounds like a good weekend.
Yes, I enjoyed it. Now we will continue and extend your speaking about your weekend.
In this section, you will build longer stories and add more details.
You will practice talking about a planned weekend, a surprise weekend, a lazy weekend, and a family weekend.
Speak clearly and repeat when you see. Speak clearly and repeat when you see. Let's start with a planned weekend.
Last weekend I had a plan. Last weekend I had a plan.
On Saturday morning I woke up early. On Saturday morning I woke up early.
I had breakfast with my family. I had breakfast with my family.
Then I went to the gym. Then I went to the gym.
In the afternoon, I met my friends at a cafe. In the afternoon, I met my friends at a cafe.
In the evening, I watched a movie at the cinema. In the evening, I watched a movie at the cinema.
On Sunday, I visited my grandparents. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents.
I prepared my clothes and bag for Monday. I prepared my clothes and bag for Monday.
Say 2 things you planned last weekend. Say 2 things you planned last weekend.
Now a surprise weekend.
Last weekend was surprising. Last weekend was surprising.
On Saturday, my friend invited me to a party. On Saturday, my friend invited me to a party.
I did not expect the invitation. I did not expect the invitation.
We celebrated and had fun. We celebrated and had fun.
On Sunday, I rested because I was tired. On Sunday, I rested because I was tired.
It was an unexpected but happy weekend. It was an unexpected but happy weekend.
Say 1 surprising thing that happened last weekend. Say 1 surprising thing that happened last weekend.
Now a lazy weekend.
Last weekend was very relaxing. Last weekend was very relaxing.
I stayed in bed until late. I stayed in bed until late.
I watched TV for a few hours. I watched TV for a few hours.
I ordered food online. I ordered food online.
I listened to music and relaxed. I listened to music and relaxed.
I did not do much work. I did not do much work.
Say 1 thing you did on a lazy weekend. Say 1 thing you did on a lazy weekend.
Now a family weekend.
On Saturday, I spent time with my family. On Saturday, I spent time with my family.
We had lunch together. We had lunch together.
We went to the park in the afternoon. We went to the park in the afternoon.
In the evening we played board games. In the evening we played board games.
On Sunday, we visited relatives. On Sunday, we visited relatives.
It was a warm and happy weekend. It was a warm and happy weekend.
Say 1 family activity you did last weekend. Say 1 family activity you did last weekend.
Now let's build a longer weekend story.
Last weekend was very enjoyable. Last weekend was very enjoyable.
On Saturday morning I cleaned my house. On Saturday morning I cleaned my house.
In the afternoon, I met my friends and had coffee. In the afternoon, I met my friends and had coffee.
In the evening I watched a movie at home. In the evening I watched a movie at home.
On Sunday, I visited my grandparents. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents.
We had lunch together and talked for hours. We had lunch together and talked for hours.
In the evening, I prepared for the new week. In the evening, I prepared for the new week.
Overall, it was a wonderful weekend. Overall, it was a wonderful weekend.
Say the full weekend story. Say the full weekend story.
Now realistic scenario at work on Monday morning. How was your weekend?
My weekend was wonderful. On Saturday, I met my friends and watched a movie. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents and had lunch with them. I also prepared for the week.
Repeat key sentences.
My weekend was wonderful. My weekend was wonderful.
On Saturday, I met my friends and watched a movie. On Saturday, I met my friends and watched a movie.
On Sunday, I visited my grandparents. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents.
Answer the question about your weekend at work. Answer the question about your weekend at work. Now realistic scenario at school. What did you do on Sunday?
On Sunday, I woke up late and had breakfast. Then I did my homework. In the afternoon, I played football with my friends. In the evening, I relaxed and watched TV.
Repeat important sentences.
On Sunday, I woke up late and had breakfast. On Sunday, I woke up late and had breakfast.
Then I did my homework. Then I did my homework.
In the afternoon, I played football with my friends. In the afternoon, I played football with my friends.
Describe your Sunday in detail. Describe your Sunday in detail. Now let's correct more common mistakes. I was go to my friend's house.
Correct sentence. I went to my friend's house. Correct sentence. I went to my friend's house.
I did not went anywhere.
Correct sentence. I did not go anywhere. Correct sentence. I did not go anywhere.
I have watched TV yesterday.
Correct sentence. I watched TV yesterday. Correct sentence. I watched TV yesterday.
I was very exciting last weekend.
Correct sentence. I was very excited last weekend. Correct sentence. I was very excited last weekend.
I stayed at home and boring.
Correct sentence. I stayed at home and felt bored. Correct sentence. I stayed at home and felt bored. Now extended shadowing practice. Last weekend was very enjoyable. Last weekend was very enjoyable.
On Saturday morning, I cleaned my house and went shopping. On Saturday morning, I cleaned my house and went shopping.
In the afternoon, I met my friends and had coffee. In the afternoon, I met my friends and had coffee.
On Sunday, I visited my grandparents and had lunch with them. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents and had lunch with them.
In the evening, I prepared for the new week. In the evening, I prepared for the new week. Again, faster. Last weekend was very enjoyable, and I had a great time. Last weekend was very enjoyable, and I had a great time.
On Saturday, I cleaned my house, went shopping, and met my friends. On Saturday, I cleaned my house, went shopping, and met my friends.
On Sunday, I visited my grandparents, had lunch with them, and prepared for the week. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents, had lunch with them, and prepared for the week.
Now listen to a final natural conversation. How was your weekend?
My weekend was wonderful. On Saturday, I cleaned my house, went shopping, and met my friends. On Sunday, I visited my grandparents and had lunch with them. In the evening, I prepared for the new week. It was a very enjoyable weekend.
That sounds like a perfect weekend.
Yes, I really enjoyed it. Great work today.
You practiced describing your weekend in many detailed ways.
You talked about busy, relaxing, and family weekends.
You corrected common mistakes.
You completed multiple shadowing rounds.
Keep practicing every day.
The more you speak, the more confident you will become.
If this lesson helped you, please subscribe to Fluent Career English.
Subscribe to Fluent Career English for more speaking practice and daily English lessons.
See you in the next lesson.